Oh, hey, hi. Thank you for listening to my webinar, Part 3, Contemplative Practices for Conjuring Being. I'm JP Morgan, and I left something out that I want to make sure that I get across to you, so I'm making this video to share it with you. And that thing that I left out was, how do I know whether or not these affirmations, these declarations are working? Very important question. Let me get my notes. Let's see there, right here, my iPad. Should have that ready. Okay, so first of all, before I go through my points, I've got 4 points as to how to know whether it's working or not. I want to talk about how important this is. So one of the things that has people stop doing anything that creates change is they don't feel like it's working, and so they stop doing it. Now, the thing is, if something's not changing, it's really actually because you're not seeing the change, because everything is always changing. It's either getting worse or getting better. But the thing is that we typically look for evidence as to whether or not something's changing by looking at what's the same. And the other thing that's true is there's always stuff that's the same. So something's going to change in some ways and not change in other ways, and there's going to be some of both. So if our attention is always looking at what's the same as to evidence as to whether something's changing, then we're always going to see stuff is the same, and we're going to think that it means it's not changing. But it's not true. There's other things that are changing when we see something's the same. So if you want to stay engaged in the process of change for anything, not just affirmations, you want to focus on the portion that's different. There's always something different. Even if it's microscopic, there is going to be a difference in a change that's happening. And the reason to put your attention on that is not to distract you from some things haven't changed. It's to put your attention on that because when you experience and see things changing, it actually engages you in the process of change even more. It adds motivation. In the same way, looking at what's the same every time while things are changing but not noticing it, looking at the same takes motivation away. Focusing on difference, on change, actually adds to motivation. And so not only do you want to see what's changing, you don't want to leave that as a passive process and just say, well, if I notice things changing, great. No, you want to be active in this. And so how do you do that? Well, you don't just wait to see things changing. You actually intentionally look for and listen for difference. Instead of unconsciously, automatically looking for and listening for sameness, you want to consciously and intentionally look for difference. So the things that I'm going to be sharing right now are things that you can look for that are different, things you can bring conscious attention to so that you draw out attention to difference, and it engages you in the motivation to continue the work of the affirmations or whatever thing you're working on changing. So 4 things. Number 1, this is the internal kind of knowing, right? And so during the process, which you saw in part 2 in the webinar series, the process of forgiving yourself for your negative unconscious affirmation that you brought up to consciousness, forgiving yourself for that, and you create this spaciousness, this opening. During that process, you develop a subtle awareness of your internal experience of something being true, you being attached to something, letting go. Eugene Gendlin would call this the felt sense. It's not a feeling or an emotion where it's a big, in-depth, physical, internal, kinesthetic experience. It's a real subtle feeling. It's a subtle kinesthetic knowing, maybe the way your neurology kind of feels around your heart, or your nerves feel around your heart, or something in your gut, something in your solar plexus, something in your chest, a very subtle feeling that's associated with a knowing. Eugene Gendlin calls this a felt sense. And so what you're really looking for is a felt sense that this thing that you're speaking now is true to you. You can say something and you can just say it and have no feeling at all, or you can say something and you be like, that doesn't feel true, or you can say something and you say, that actually feels true. So when you start saying these declarations, and they're not just ideas in your mind anymore, but you're speaking them and you have a felt sense that they're true, then it's starting to take hold in you. It's starting to become real for you. It's kind of like before with the negative unconscious affirmations when you said that it's like, it doesn't feel really good to think about it, but it actually does feel true. It does feel true. And I say like, I'm ugly, it feels true. And then all of a sudden after a while, I'm beautiful, I am that I am beautiful, whatever. Actually starting to feel it. I'm starting to feel that it's true. So that's the first one. We're looking mostly at the external stuff because that's kind of an obvious one. I just wanted to give some nuance and distinction to how to feel whether or not something is true. And the point is that a felt sense more than like a big emotional experience. So the second thing is, catch yourself saying or thinking, well, that's because ... and then your declaration or your affirmation follows. Well, I didn't buy that, and that's because I'm frugal spending, which is an idea that I've intentionally created as myself. In the same way as you would before maybe say things, well, I didn't do that because I don't do things that are scary. Well, I did that because I do things that are scary. It's all of a sudden your declaration which we've been, if you listen to part 3 of the webinar, you've been consciously contemplating causality for. You just unconsciously give the reason, or you'd notice the reason that you did something, you just consider it was because I am this, or because this thing that I believe is true. We're not like you're trying to convince yourself of the affirmation is true or say it to believe it. It would just become the reason why. You would just mention it that way. And so for me, I've noticed myself not buying some things on Amazon now because I just not buy it and say, oh, I didn't buy that. I wonder why. Oh, it's because I'm frugal spending. It's just something that I've created as who I am, and I didn't do that because of that. It's just kind of clear and obvious. So when your affirmations or declarations start jumping out at you as the reason why you did things or said things, then it's starting to work. Notice that difference showing up. Kind of in the reverse, this is kind of the same thing, but a little bit different. Notice unconscious behaviors that you engage in because you've been taking on this declaration so much. Like, for example, I think maybe I mentioned this in the webinar, maybe I didn't, but I noticed myself doing things around the house for my wife in secret because I've had this declaration that I am discreet giving, which actually was initially intended to be around giving financially to charities and things like that, but I found it also just showing up in my way of being around the house with my wife. Like I could do the dishes and tell her about it, or yeah, I think I did mention this in the webinar, or I could just do it discreetly. And I just noticed that this behavior was coming out of me. And so new behaviors will be born from the ideas. So look at the things you're doing throughout your day, throughout your life, and say, oh, that's something that I'm doing because of that declaration. So again, this is slightly different than the previous one in that the previous one, we're noticing that ourselves are thinking that's the reason why. Whereas in this one, the third one here, we're looking at behaviors that happen because that thing was true. So it's the attention on the behavior versus the reasoning, but they're obviously very connected. And the last thing, number 4, the way to know whether or not your declarations are working and your affirmations are working is that people will actually start speaking them to you about you. You know, if you have a declaration that says, I am committed, people will start saying to you, wow, Joe, you're really committed. And when people start speaking to you without having known your declarations or affirmations, when they start telling you the things that you've been telling yourself, it's a pretty good sign it's working, because not only you're embodying it, but you're embodying it so much that it's going out into the world and it's resonating with the world and people are experiencing it and they're speaking it to you to describe you, who you are, and how you be, which is an unbelievably satisfying and validating experience. When people start telling you the things you've been telling yourself, then it's a really fair bet that you're nailing it. So have that as an intention. Have your commitment be to speaking these things as so true that not only do you be them, but people feel it so much that they tell you them. That's what I have for you on how to know whether or not your affirmation declarations are working. Focus on the difference, stay engaged, stay motivated, keep contemplating causality, keep speaking your word, and you will create. Abracadabra, I love you. See you soon.